All right. So we're going to start chapter 4. This first lecture will be over sections 1 and 2. And when the appropriate reading comes up, I will be sure to point that out to you guys. All right. So in chapter 4, we're going to really be looking at ecosystems and living organisms, and in particular, relationships between those living organisms. So we'll look at like predator-prey relationships, different types of symbiosis. And then, of course, you know how the development of species and their relationships has changed over time. All right. So with Chapter 4, Section 1, which does accompany pages 64 through 68, part of what we're going to look at is the role of evolution. Now, some of you guys have had some teaching in the process of evolution. For this class, the focus is not so much like origin of the species and so on, which is actually an interesting topic, don't get me wrong. We're really just looking at how coevolutionary relationships kind of shape ecosystems, right? So when one organism is being chased down by another organism, so in a predator-prey relationship, how that affects the development of both species, and that's that coevolutionary process. But some fundamentals in evolution. First of all, when we talk about biological evolution, we're just talking about changes in the gene pool of a species, of a population of organisms that occurs over time. And we can actually watch this happen, in relatively recent history with things that reproduce really quickly, like bacteria. We can watch a population of bacteria change due to different selective pressures. So the mainstream depiction of evolution is the type that occurs over millions and tens or hundreds of millions of years, and really what concerns us is the type that occurs over relatively short periods, and I mean relatively short, and that just makes a population look a little different, its coloring, etc. Okay. And so, the current theories of biological evolution were proposed by Charles Darwin. You guys probably already know that. And he published his first major work, I should say, on the origin of the species in 1859 was when it was published, just before the American Civil War. So I think the American Civil War started in 1861, so right around the same time, interestingly. And really, his big contribution, his big splash, all the controversy, all that was on his ideas of evolution. But his probably major contribution, and that has stood the test of time, and in light of new evidence, still stands, is this idea of natural selection. And this is the part that I said we can actually watch happen with things like bacteria that reproduce really quickly. We could watch it happen more slowly with fossil record, but we can watch this kind of in real time. All right. So when we talk about natural selection, we are referring to the fact that better adapted individuals, okay, and in biology, better adapted just means they're more suited for the environment they live in, so they're more likely to survive, right, and reproduce. And it's really that survive and reproduce part of this idea that's going to be most important to us. And we'll kind of explain why here. All right. So the 4 observations that anybody can go out in nature and watch are these. Number 1, all species produce more offspring than will actually survive to maturity. All right. This is true of every species out there. Not all of the offspring actually make it to maturity. And again, when we talk about maturity, we're talking about sexual maturity, in which case they are old enough to then have offspring. Okay, which of course is going to happen at a different time for different species. All right. 2, all species exhibit some variation. Now, it's really easy to see variation in any species, like of mammals. It's a little harder to see in bacteria, but any species, bacteria, they're not genetically uniform. There's going to be some variation in their gene pool. It might be something invisible. It might be something we can't see. There's lots of types of variation. But first of all, we have more offspring that actually will survive. All populations exhibit at least some genetic variation, and this is important. Okay. 3, there are limits to how big a population can get. All right. So within a particular ecosystem, that ecosystem imposes what's called environmental resistance. Right. So we're going to have a limited food supply, or a limited amount of space, or a limited amount of water. All right. And that's going to keep the population from just growing indefinitely. And 4, differential reproductive success. And this is kind of the kicker here. What ties everything together is the individuals with the most favorable traits for their specific environment are more likely to reproduce. Okay? And when they reproduce, right, they're going to produce more offspring with those same traits, which can then increase their proportion in the population over time. And that's it. Again, this is stuff that we can actually watch happen in real time with species that, will reproduce multiple times in a day. Things like bacteria. All right. So again, I'm going to walk us back to, first of all, not all offspring survive. And there's a variety of reasons, but some of them just aren't fit. In terms of fitness, I mean they don't have the traits that will allow them to compete and survive in their specific environment. All right. All populations have variation, so we're going to have a variety of colors, a variety of intelligences, a variety of immune capabilities, the ability to fight off illness, a variety of abilities to compete with other organisms. Okay. Because of that competition and disease and the ability to get food, right, that puts a limit on how big our population is going to get. And as a result of these 3 tenets, right, we have this differential reproductive success, which tells us that not all the organisms are going to survive to maturity, right? Therefore, the ones that do survive are more likely to be the ones that are better suited for the environment in which they live. Because they're the ones that survive, they're the ones that are more likely to reproduce and will therefore produce more individuals with at least similar traits to what they have. All right? And there's a cool video I'll be showing you guys tomorrow on what's called the rock pocket mouse that kind of exhibits this little minor changes in a population that can occur over time, like maybe when the environment changes. This is pretty interesting. All right, and so just for anecdotal, that's not anecdotal, excuse me, that's a really bad word, really poor choice of words. Just the kind of the cliche example out there, just because Darwin used it, as the Galapagos finches, whose beaks on different islands, based on the climate of that island and the available food, they were all finches, and it was obvious that they had all shared a common ancestor. But there were these minor differences, in some cases actually major differences, in the shape of their beaks. And it was based on the type of food that was available due to various climate differences and amounts of moisture and soil types and so on. It's pretty interesting. So that, where the food would favor a longer beak, right, for sipping nectar from flowers, the finches on that island had the slightly longer beak, where the cactus finch would eat insects and seeds and needed a kind of a more robust beak for cracking open those seeds. Anyways, so in life, right? So your basic biology here. There's what are called 3 domains. There's domain archaea, and these are what they call extremophiles, right? They live in very hot, low oxygen, acidic environments. And you remember we talked about those hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean. It's these archaea prokaryotes, which are very similar to bacteria. Oftentimes people just call them bacteria, that are actually the base of that food chain. All right. Then we have prokarya, which would be your some parasites and bacteria. All bacteria are prokaryotes, right? And then we have eukarya. Now, you guys will have to remember back to your cell biology days. Hopefully some of you guys took some cell biology as a freshman. Prokaryote versus eukaryote. Prokaryotes which includes prokarya and archaea, their cells do not have a distinct nucleus, right? So you and me, and all mammals, plants, fungus, and protists, right? Our cells have a distinct nucleus, which is just kind of a little membrane wrapped around your chromosomes, which contain all of your genetic information, right? Bacteria and archaea don't have that distinct nucleus. It's just kind of in the cell without being wrapped in a membrane. All right? So here's our three domains. We got archaea, we got bacteria, and then or prokarya. Okay? And then animals, fungus, plants, and protists, right, all make up the eukarya. Right? So they now say that there are 6 kingdoms of life, right? And so you and I would be part of domain eukarya, kingdom animalia, right? So that goes domain, kingdom, phylum, and then class, order, family, genus, species. We're not going to get into that. But anyways, so coevolution. So when we talk about coevolution, we are speaking of the fact, actually, that organisms do not survive and reproduce in isolation. They do so in the presence of other species, other plants, other bacteria, and so on. And so in reality, all evolution is coevolution. Okay? So evolution of one species impacts the evolution of another. And this is really our focus for this chapter. How are species interacting within an ecosystem, and how did that relationship develop? Okay? So ecosystems, through natural selection and over millennium, have evolved to coexist. And so if you go to an undisturbed ecosystem, you'll see this dynamic equilibrium that we talked about way back in chapter 1. There's going to be, minor disturbances from nature, slight little climate changes, maybe one year's a little drier or wetter than another, right? But everything is just kind of cooperating, right? Everything remains in balance. These little negative feedbacks kick in. The population of prey might go up, but that causes the predator population to go up, which then causes the population of prey to go back down, which then causes the predator population to go back down. And it follows these little cycles. Everything's in equilibrium. That's because these ecosystems have developed together. And so everything found its balance over time. All right? And that's that idea of coevolution, which is all evolution. All right? And so these coevolutionary relationships gave rise to these communities. Communities can be anything from what they call nurse log. So when trees die, they fall and they slowly decompose over time. And it's actually interesting what these nurse logs do for an ecosystem. They create these little biological communities. Some trees actually grow on top of the nurse log. You can see this happen over the Olympic Peninsula, same as like Mount Rainier and stuff. It's pretty cool. All right? But again, because these relationships kind of co-evolve over time, it takes these communities lots of years to establish themselves. All right? And so we're going to move on to section 2 here, in which case we're actually going to talk about a process called succession, which is a really important topic actually in environmental science. All right? So that is pages 69 through 73 of chapter 4. All right? So succession, right? It refers to the process where a community develops slowly through a series of species, right? So we're really talking about 2 different types. We've got what's called primary succession and secondary, and we'll differentiate what those 2 types are in just a minute. But essentially, we have a new ecosystem developing. So this could be something like after a forest fire, right? So we've wiped out the original community. So it's a really nasty forest or wildfire, right? And what's going to happen over time is there's a series of species that repopulate that area. And now the first species that comes in alters the environment a little bit and makes it fit for other species to then come in. And this pattern in which species come first and which follow is what we call succession. Okay? Those early species are what they call pioneer species. And depending on how the ecosystem begins is whether it's what we call primary or secondary. Okay, so we'll differentiate those terms right now. So primary succession. Okay, we're talking about a new ecosystem. So not the case of where a forest fire wiped out an existing ecosystem. We're talking about, let's say, maybe right after a lava flow, where our substrate is rocks or something like that. There's actually no soil present for primary succession. All right. And so we can actually go outside and see where some of these lichen are starting to try to do their thing, okay? So bare rocks, a cooled lava field, something like that, where there's no soil present, and that's kind of the kicker, all right, that differentiates primary succession from secondary, all right? And what happens with primary succession is it's slow because we have to actually get the soil formation to occur, all right? And just plain old weathering and erosion will be part of that, but there's also a biological component to soil formation. And that's what this little graphic right here shows. All right, it's essentially the order in which species come in. So we'll talk a little bit about what lichens do and then mosses and grasses and shrubs here, okay, and why it follows this pattern. Okay, so lichen, right? I'll show you some examples on the next slide, and I can actually take you outside to show you some as well. But lichen are the little algae and fungus symbionts, right? And what they do is they attach directly to rocks, and they essentially get their nutrients from rainwater and air. They don't need soil present. They just need something to attach to, like rocks, okay? And what the lichen do, though, as a natural byproduct of their respiration is some acids, right? And the acids secreted by the lichen actually cause the rock to break down into mineral particles a little more quickly. All right. Over time, then, right, we will develop some mosses. I'll come back to that. Sorry. Right. So from lichen, we go to mosses. So moss doesn't need much soil. Right. Moss can kind of attach to tree bark. Moss can attach to rocks where you have these little pockets of mineral particles, right? And what we get with the moss is then, because we have some mineral particles, right, we get the moss that will, over time, die and decompose. And so what we're starting to do is add some organic material to our mineral particles. And essentially, when you do that, you start getting soil, all right? So we go from lichen to mosses. Once mosses have built up just enough soil, some of our more hardy grasses can then take root, right? Which again will grow, and then they'll die and decompose. All the while we have weather and erosion making more mineral particles. We're adding more and more organic material to that. After a few thousand years, right, of this, we then have some soil, in which case we can start to grow some shrubs, and then if the climate permits, we can have a full-fledged forest. All right. So again, we start with maybe bare rocks, right? Weathering, erosion, and things like lichen build up the mineral particles. We can then start to get some grasses and mosses, and then eventually some shrubs, and then over time, thousands of years, we're talking, not millions, but thousands, we can then work our way into a forest ecosystem. Again, that's if and only if the climate in that area permits it, right? We're not going to have a forest way down in our desert regions, just because the climate's not going to permit that type of wildlife to occur. All right. So secondary succession then is differentiated from primary in that this is more like that case of the wildfire. So succession begins in an environment following destruction of all or part of the earlier community, right? So an open area after a fire or an abandoned farmland, right? So in a farm, we can come in, we take out the native vegetation to grow food, for example. Sometimes we let that go back to nature. The order in which species repopulate that area, where soil is already present, right, is what we call secondary succession. So it's important that we know that primary succession or secondary doesn't follow primary. It's a different type of succession with a different starting point. Okay, and so doesn't follow primary succession. And as a result, it occurs more rapidly. In fact, if you go out to Blue Mountain Mall on your way to like Home Depot or something, you can see secondary succession taking hold much more quickly. Okay, so again, how will secondary succession occur? It begins with what they call annual weeds and grasses, right? Annuals, by the way, are the ones that grow in 1 year, die, drop seeds, and then new plants grow the next year, as opposed to growing from the same plant. Then we move on to perennials, right? Things that survive multiple years, right? And then what we're starting to do as these species grow is we're increasing our soil quality. Over time, we can get some seedlings and move our way to a pine forest, over to like mature hardwood oaks or something like that, which again, only going to happen in the right type of climate. All right, I'm getting a little long-winded on you guys, so I didn't want to spend too much time. So what you need to be able to do as a result of what you hear and read today is, first of all, you need to be able to discuss natural selection as it relates to this idea of coevolution. Okay, species don't evolve in isolation; evolve together. That creates that balance in our ecosystem, right? And then relate that idea then over to communities, and in particular succession patterns. And with succession, you need to be able to differentiate between primary and secondary succession. Remember, primary begins with no soil. Here would be our general pattern. Again, this is oversimplified. Lichen first, then mosses, then grasses, then shrubs, then a forest, if the climate permits. And secondary succession, right, already has soil presence, so it's going to occur much more rapidly, and it would usually begin with annual weeds, then perennial weeds, then saplings, and then pine trees over to a mature hardwood forest, if the climate permits. All right, that is it for sections 1 and 2.